Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce Differently podcast. In today's episode of Divorce Talks with Irwin Mitchell, we're diving into what it really means to divorce in England when your spouse lives abroad, a situation that a lot of people face, but very few truly understand. So questions often arise around whether you could start the process if you don't know where your spouse is, or how to serve papers overseas, or what happens when one of the two is navigating the English legal system from abroad. So it's an important topic because cross-border divorces bring unique risks, practical challenges, and mistakes that can be really costly if you don't know what to expect. To talk about this, I've invited Clare Wiseman. Clare is a partner and the National Head of Family and International Family Law at Irwin Mitchell. She has over 30 years' experience advising national and international clients on complex family law matters. Clare leads the firm's international family team, specializing in cross-border issues involving finances, children, and international relocation. Clare, it's great to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, great to be on board. Thanks, Chloe. Looking forward to our discussion.
I am too, because this is something that comes up a lot with international clients. Um, it's quite common for people not to be in the same country, and sometimes with their spouse abroad, it creates a lot more challenges with regards to filing for divorce and even leading the process itself. So I guess I'd start with the practical implications on the divorce proceedings. I mentioned, can you serve your spouse if they're abroad? Can you even file if they're not in the country?
Yeah, it's a great topic to start with, Chloe, and it does crop up quite frequently in international cases where a couple may have gone abroad, the relationship breaks down, and suddenly one spouse has sort of disappeared.
Hmm.
And from my experience, that adds an additional layer of complexity, frustration, and stress on what is
Yes.
already a stressful situation, isn't it? So, the first point I would say is if you don't have an address, don't despair. There
Hmm.
are procedures we can follow, and they tend to fall into two sort of separate categories. So,
Okay.
firstly, it might be that you've got to look at another way to effect service.
Okay.
If I could bring that to life, for example, most of our divorce processes now are dealt with digitally, but
Yes.
it might be you don't have an email address. So, we've certainly used in the past things like social media,
Ah,
WhatsApp,
okay.
Facebook, Instagram.
Hmm.
We might make inquiries through friends, family, work colleagues. We've certainly served at workplaces or work
Okay.
addresses, and that might be by email again, or it might be personal service.
Okay.
And then the only word of caution I would say about that when you're looking at it in the international context, we just have to be mindful as to whether that's going to be valid service. So
Ah,
is that a
okay.
valid method either in the UK or in the overseas jurisdiction?
Okay.
So that's the sort of first category of cases in answer to your question if you don't have an address.
Yes.
The second class of cases is where your spouse has disappeared completely. So
Hmm.
you might have tried those methods. You can't satisfy the court that you have served the papers on them, but you
Yeah.
understandably still want to proceed. And the test that the English court applies in that scenario is, have you undertaken all reasonable attempts to effect service?
Okay.
So your clients would keep evidence of the steps that I've just described.
Hmm.
And then we might make additional inquiries through things like public data agencies,
Uh-huh.
HMRC, visa applications, and visa agencies. And as a last resort, I've often used PI, private investigators,
Yeah.
or tracing agents. But the good thing about the English legal system is that now we have, since we have no fault divorce, is
Yes.
you don't need the consent or the
Yes.
cooperation of your spouse. You can still get to a conclusion.
Yes. But you do have to show that I mean, it sounds like it's quite a high threshold in terms of the effort put into trying to track down your spouse.
Yeah, it is a reasonably high threshold, and you need to collate all the evidence you need to evidence those steps that you've taken.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the court wants you to be able to move on with your life. And
Yes.
if they're satisfied that you've had a really good go at it, you've tried all of those methods I've described, then normally the courts are sympathetic to you
Yes.
needing to proceed. And that applies not only to the divorce, but if you've got a spouse who's not cooperating with the financial proceedings or
Hmm.
children proceedings as well.
Yes. So that's really comforting, actually, to know that even if you've got somebody on the other side who's putting their head in the sand or just not engaging, the courts do have processes to allow you to proceed nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely right. And judges and solicitors in certain circumstances have the power to sign transfers of property, for pensions to be transferred. So, yes, there are workarounds. But understandably, the bar is quite high just to make sure that somebody who should be involved in the process has been given proper opportunity to do so.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I guess that does create some frustration, as you were saying earlier, for the person who's trying to proceed with the divorce, because I guess it's extra time, extra costs in doing that due diligence and trying to track down the other person.
Absolutely right. And certainly we see clients where they have had to take legal advice for
Hmm.
that very reason. And as you say,
Yeah.
then it's more costly, it takes longer, and never mind the additional emotional stress.
Yes, exactly. So even once you track down the person and you've served them, they do need to participate. There's, financial disclosure and hearings and mediation, etc. How does that happen when the person is abroad? Can that be accommodated, or do they actually need to be in the UK for that to happen?
No, they don't need to be in the UK for that to happen. And certainly post pandemic, most of our initial court applications and court hearings and many of our client meetings are remote, even where the
Yes,
client is in the UK. So that works incredibly well where we've got clients or opponents or other team members overseas. So
yes,
that digital platform works well for meetings, for court hearings, for mediation, as you've
yes.
described, Chloe. And that has a number of benefits, both sort of legal and practical.
Hmm.
Some of the ones that spring to mind are it saves time, it
Yes.
saves cost,
Hmm.
it can be more flexible. In my experience, it's much easier to accommodate time zones where
Yes,
you've just got to hop on an hour Zoom call rather
absolutely.
than hop on a flight. It avoids delay,
Hmm.
waiting for physical court hearings or physical travel. And the particular benefit with overseas clients, particularly high profile clients, is it gives that privacy. So you
Yes,
haven't
that's
got
true.
clients having to turn up at court. They can do
Yeah,
it from the privacy of their home or their office.
yeah.
On the flip side, Chloe, I think it's important for us to think of there's certainly some risks around
Uh-huh.
the digital platforms. So again, I was thinking about things like data security, making sure you're in a private environment.
Yes,
Certainly,
there's
if
no one in
you're
the
in a
background. Yeah,
exactly if you're in a court hearing, there's now a declaration you have to give at the start of a remote hearing to say that there's no friends or family members in the vicinity. We have to be careful with AI, don't we? That
yes,
images and
it's
messages are
true.
not being tampered with
Yeah.
or interfered with, and that's why I'm seeing the increase use of certain apps, parenting
Hmm.
apps, communication apps, and so on. But there are still some court hearings that have to be in person,
Yeah,
particularly where there's cross examination of a
yes.
witness or a party.
Yes, but it's true that the government has really modernized the process with this online portal, for applying. All the disclosure, I guess, is done by email these days. There's no more need to physically bring documents to certain locations. So, in terms of how the process unfolds, it's pretty much the same. It doesn't really matter where you are, really.
No, exactly that. And all the evidence can be filed electronically, as you
Yeah,
suggest. And it's much more convenient for us and clients because we can deal with it on the move. Clients can deal with it on the move.
absolutely.
And you haven't got to sort of lump heavy lever arch files around the world with you.
Exactly, and that could get lost or whatnot.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So from your experience, I know you work in international divorce a lot as well. What are some of the biggest mistakes that people make when they're getting divorced across borders?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I always say to clients, and the first consideration is it's stating the obvious, really, Chloe, but be alive to the fact that procedures and laws are different depending
Yes.
which country you're in.
Don't assume
Um,
because you know one country, it'll be the same elsewhere.
That's exactly right. And clients often are surprised that there's not only legal differences, but obviously cultural differences in
Mhm.
some jurisdictions and certainly procedural differences. So
Yes,
that's the first sort of flag. I'm sure you come across that as well.
absolutely.
Secondly, just being alive to immigration and visa status. So
Yes.
if you are in a country because you're the spouse of a working partner, be careful that that isn't jeopardised by a separation or a divorce. You were just touching on the collation of evidence, the rules
Hmm.
of evidence, and the type of evidence that is admissible
Yeah.
can differ from country to country. You've got translation issues, so making
Yes. And
time
costs.
exactly the cost of
Yeah.
getting things translated and making sure we have enough time to do that. From a financial point of view, there's also some sort of financial flags and risks. So things like different tax regimes,
Yes.
um, movement of money around the globe can have different consequences at different times.
Especially for American citizens. I don't know if you've had that experience, but because they're taxed everywhere, you could
Absolutely.
be making a transaction in the UK, which seems like it has no relevance to the US tax system, and it does.
Yeah, and the US system, as you quite rightly say, is very wide reaching, isn't it? And
Hmm.
you never lose it. So sometimes people think, well, actually, I'm now domiciled in England and Wales. That doesn't apply. And of course it does. So the
Yes.
US is certainly a jurisdiction to watch on. And talking about the US, we've seen quite recently big fluctuations in the exchange rates, which
Yes.
has had a big impact on a settlement depending on timing.
Yes. And who typically bears the cost or the risk related to the exchange rate?
It very much depends. So there's a general policy of updating your schedule of assets or your
Hmm.
valuation of assets at every hearing. And
Yes.
so we will see if fluctuation is adverse or positive to one party or the other. But
Yeah.
sometimes it depends how the order is worded. So if you're receiving a fixed sum of money, then
Yeah.
you're unlikely to take the risk. Whereas if the other spouse is having the balancing payment, then
Hmm.
he or she may see the effect of the fluctuation in exchange
Yeah.
rates more readily.
Yeah. So those are typical examples of all those complexities you were talking about earlier that really in a local divorce you wouldn't even have to worry about, but suddenly can really derail the experience. I mean, the immigration example you give is really important, and I think it's something people forget. I had a client who was here on a spousal visa, hadn't anticipated it, the impact of divorcing on her status, then started trying to get her visa sorted through her employer and lost her job. So she physically
Wow.
couldn't stay here. And that had a huge impact on the child arrangements, on all of the finances, all of it. And actually, if she'd anticipated it a bit, she might have been able to sort it out before filing for divorce and not have to deal with it in a rush.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right, and you make a really valuable point there about the impact on children.
Hmm.
So the visa status, as you quite rightly say, can impact whether you can stay with your children, whether you can move with your children after
Absolutely.
separation. So yeah, immigration is certainly we involve our immigration team a lot in our family cases for sort of planning a move,
Absolutely.
planning a settlement.
So for people who get to the other end where they are finally divorced, hopefully for them that's how they feel finally, but they how do they make sure that the orders they get in an English court can be enforced elsewhere? And I'm thinking particularly around child maintenance.
Yeah, so generally speaking, when we're looking at the enforcement of orders overseas, we
Hmm.
have to think about three things. So, is that order valid in the
Hmm.
overseas jurisdiction? Is it going to be recognised? And as you
Yeah.
quite rightly say, most importantly, is it going to be enforced? Because otherwise,
Yes,
it's somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory, isn't it? If you get a settlement or
exactly.
an order and then you can't do anything with it. So, since Brexit, things are definitely more complicated, certainly from
Yeah.
the UK perspective. So,
Yeah.
the first thing you would be looking at is your order pre December 2020 or post December 2020, because
Okay.
that can have quite a big impact. So,
Hmm.
certainly, I would encourage our listeners to have a look at that.
Hmm.
Secondly, we would look at whether there's any reciprocal treaties with the
Okay.
relevant jurisdiction. So are there agreements where they readily accept that a UK order is recognised and enforceable overseas,
Hmm.
and there's certain conventions and regulations that we can rely on. But we're often taking overseas advice at that point. So
Yeah.
we're joining up with our networks, with our friends overseas to ask them whether the order we're anticipating receiving is going to be enforceable. And I tend to find increasingly in practice that we're consulting with those overseas lawyers about the drafting of our order. So
Okay.
sometimes it needs a particular clause or
Hmm.
particular wording which enables the enforcement overseas to go through smoothly.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I'm sure you've heard of and your listeners may have come across is what we call a mirror order.
Yeah.
So you get a duplicate of the order in the overseas jurisdiction, which again makes enforcement more easily. A couple of points, I think, about your specific question about child maintenance
Yes.
is again two things. People often fail to recognise that the child maintenance service doesn't have jurisdiction if one parent, let's say the paying parent,
Hmm.
is overseas,
Yes.
living and working overseas. If they're working for a UK company or the
Hmm.
armed services or something like that, then you're probably okay.
Hmm.
But often you can't rely on the child maintenance service. So we're then falling on other jurisdictions, other treaties. There's a process called REMO. So
Okay.
some countries belong to REMO,
Hmm.
typically European countries, North America, Commonwealth countries. There
Yeah.
is a reciprocal arrangement with those countries which make the enforcement of your child maintenance order easier. But if it's a non-REMO country, then things can be more problematic. So I would say to your listeners, that's when they're likely to need to take more detailed legal advice.
Yes. Yeah, because child maintenance is usually the longer lasting connection and financial connection after divorce. And so when people move after divorce and there's all that life that continues to unfold, that's where those kind of issues could come up. Can you give us an example, I guess for people to try and understand what it means really, why it matters that your order would be enforceable overseas? What could happen if you didn't do that? If you didn't go through the process?
Yeah, if you don't get that right and you don't get it right before you've got your order,
Hmm.
then you can end up with what I've sort of referred to as a Pyrrhic victory. So you've spent a lot of money, you've been
Hmm.
through a very stressful process to get an order that you've got a claim on some real estate overseas, or you think you've got a claim on a pension overseas, and you just can't physically get hold of it. And we've seen lots of cases, high profile, high net worth cases in the media where
Yes.
there's, ships offshore in the Emirates or assets overseas that you just can't get hold of. So
Yes.
it's not been worth the effort. It's not been worth the stress of actually making that claim in the first
Yeah.
place. And that's why we often see with international cases that sometimes you're better off making a claim on the assets that are in the UK that you can get hold of more readily
Yes.
and leave the overseas spouse with the offshore assets that might be too expensive or too difficult to pursue.
Yeah, and I think people don't realize, and myself included when I was getting divorced, that it's not because you have a court order that everything happens. The order says that you have to transfer these properties or you have to share your pension or whatever it says, but somebody has to actually make it happen. And if the other person isn't complying, that's where it gets complicated if those assets are overseas because it becomes very hard to enforce it.
You're absolutely right. And I'm sure you must see this with the clients you support because that has huge emotional repercussions
Absolutely.
and ramifications, doesn't it? Because they feel that the hard yards are done in getting the order. But as you
Hmm.
say, the order is a piece of paper. Yes, it
Yeah.
has teeth, and the judges don't like it if it's disobeyed. But actually, the exhaustion that I see clients experience when, as you say, that the spouse is ignoring the terms of the order or isn't paying the money on time, and then they have to go through another process
Exactly.
to
When they think they were
enforce.
finally done. And I've had several clients who've had these kind of situations, and they are emotionally drained at that stage. And I th guess that's probably the bet the other person is making, is that they're just going to run out of breath and give up. But it's important to anticipate that in your agreements.
Yes.
I guess part of what I was thinking about is also the enforceability with regards to um, how do you make sure that the other person is going to stick to the parenting plan or the child arrangements order? And where does that depend on where the children live? Which jurisdiction would take that on if there was an issue?
There's some sort of complicated features around the edges of that question, but the general principle, certainly in England and Wales, is
Mhm.
that England and Wales have jurisdiction over children that are habitually resident here.
Yes.
So children living and going to school in England and Wales, then you can get orders here
Hmm.
about them. There are other cases where children might be made wards of court, for example, for protection purposes. So they
Yes.
might be coming into the jurisdiction fleetingly, or they're English nationals but based overseas and are at risk. But that's the basic principle. So if you're living overseas as a family, we will often again link up with an overseas lawyer to get advice
Hmm.
in that jurisdiction, let's say the
Yeah.
US or Australia, as to what the position is. But what you've got to be most careful about with children and international cases is not running the risk of child abduction.
Yes,
So
that's
in
true. That's a
England
very
and
big one.
Wales, yeah,
Absolutely.
it is a big one. You're right, with quite significant consequences. So certainly, from an English point of view, you can't remove a child from the jurisdiction of England and Wales to another jurisdiction without the
Yeah.
consent of the other parent or a court order.
Yes. And so the other thing the other example that's coming to mind is, we're talking about the enforceability of your consent, your financial consent order or of your child arrangements order. But then there's also the recognition of the divorce itself. I had a client whose husband had divorced her in Dubai without her knowledge. Somehow, I don't know what the process is in detail, but he was able to divorce her without her even knowing. And so that divorce, whether it was recognized in the UK, became a legal battle. And so how does that get dealt with in terms of, you think you're divorced, you led the whole process in the UK, but the country where your spouse lives doesn't recognize it.
You're absolutely right. The issue over the recognition of competing jurisdictions or competing orders can be tricky.
Hmm.
And the UAE is a jurisdiction, particularly Dubai, as you've described. They have a divorce process which is very rapid,
Okay.
and you can get from start to finish in a matter of weeks, as
Hmm.
opposed to several months, several months
Yes.
here in England. And the process of engagement in that divorce process is very different to ours. So I'm
Hmm.
not surprised you've come across that. And certainly we have lots of cases, particularly, I'm afraid to say, where you've got the financially weaker spouse is the wife,
Hmm.
where they can be disadvantaged in that jurisdiction. So
Yeah.
very important to take urgent advice as to whether you have been adequately divorced there or you need to do something here. And that's where you can get into jurisdiction battles. So
Yes.
one spouse tries to issue here, the other spouse might issue in Dubai, and then the court has to make a decision as to which jurisdiction is going to be the one that continues to deal with the process.
Yeah.
And they're very expensive
I can imagine.
applications.
And you could find even yourself in situations of polygamy without even realizing it, because you think you're divorced, but actually in whatever other country you're not. So I can see how it could lead to a
Absolutely.
lot of issues.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. Polygamy, bigamy, it is a worry, and yeah, we've certainly had cases where that's been a real concern, and just not the ability to not get that clarity about
Yes.
what stage in the process you're at.
And that's the importance of speaking to lawyers in all the relevant places to make sure you have everything covered.
Yes,
So just coming
absolutely.
back to the children side of things, when So one of the misconceptions I often hear is that if one of the parents is not involved, whether they live abroad or locally, they're not involved, so I can do whatever I want. I don't have to engage with them, etc. But I guess it's exacerbated when the person is physically removed as well. And you've got, an ex who lives in Japan is not involved in the children's life. It's very tempting to just proceed as if you were the only parent. What obligations does the parent who is living with the children have with regards to keeping the other person involved?
Yet they do have an obligation to keep the other person involved, especially if they have what we call parental responsibility.
Hmm.
So that would include things like an obligation to keep them involved in relation to any key medical decisions,
Yeah,
educational decisions, just welfare decisions generally. And you're right, certainly if, say, the mother's in this country and the father's been working overseas for many months, many years, there can be a tendency for them just to get used to making those day-to-day decisions on their
yeah.
own. But the bigger decisions, like a change of school, going to secondary school, you should still consult with that other parent. So
And what
certainly,
happens if you don't? Are you at risk of the other parent having a claim against you, or what could be the consequences?
they would, what they would do in that situation, the non-resident parent would make an application to the court here in England for what we call a specific issue order.
Hmm.
So if they haven't been consulted about something or they disagree with something, let's say
Yeah,
the mum wants to put them into a fee paying secondary school, or change their school or have an
yeah.
operation, they can ask the court to step in and referee, or to help them have a voice in that decision making process.
Okay.
If the parents can't agree, then the court will make an order
Hmm.
themselves. So
Okay.
there's in my experience not so much a consequence of the other parent making decisions unilaterally, but there
Hmm.
is a mechanism, as I say, to step in and get that sort of power imbalance
Yes.
readjusted.
Yeah.
And that extends also to a responsibility to enable the children to have time with that
Hmm.
parent who's overseas. And we were speaking earlier about the benefits of the digital world that we live in. So things like FaceTime,
Yes.
communication visually and by message, and also visits overseas with the
Yes.
non-resident parent.
And so for the parent who is abroad, they have rights. Do they have obligations as well?
The main obligation they have is along the financial terms, so
Yeah.
to pay child maintenance even if they're overseas,
Hmm.
and to provide that parental support for the child.
Yes.
But again, I find that some clients are actually frustrated because they're not trying to stop that contact and that parental relationship. They're in fact trying to encourage it. And they
Yes.
feel disappointed sometimes that the other parent has gone overseas and it's almost out of sight, out of mind. And
Yeah.
they're not playing the role of the parent as much as our clients would like.
And that's important to highlight, actually, that in England and Wales, you cannot force someone to have contact with their children. And sometimes it's very hard to accept.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I bet I would imagine there's far more emotional consequences of
Yeah.
that than legal necessarily.
But there's certainly lifestyle implications, are there, for the parent who's living with the children or the child? If they can't force the other, I mean, would you really want to force them to start with? But even, even in the context where you can't, that's, extra childcare responsibility for them. It has an impact on their career. It has a lot of, cost implications, etc., because they're doing all the parenting on their own.
And that applies particularly in my experience in school holidays, where
Hmm.
you've got long school holidays
Yeah.
and the parent isn't sort of pulling their weight in relation to having the children for a proportion of the holiday. And of course,
Hmm.
that's even more difficult if the parent is overseas and you've got the
Yeah,
cost of travel. Can the children travel on their own to the other
absolutely.
destination? Or do they need a chaperone, and all the additional costs? So you're right. Sometimes there's an air of sort of frustration and resentment because the left behind parent is put to all the additional time and trouble and cost of that when
Yeah,
it wasn't their decision to move abroad in the first place.
absolutely. So, Claire, just to wrap up, what would be your top three tips then for people who are getting divorced in this situation where their spouse and themselves are not in the same country? What would be the top three things they need to keep in mind?
So I think, and I guess our discussion has really brought this to light, is take advice.
Yes.
It's don't assume, take advice. Things are very different from one country to another.
Mhm.
The second thing I would say is to, if you have got children, try and put them at the heart of all of your decision making process. And finally, I think certainly in the digital age, as we've highlighted, is be innovative, be flexible. There's lots of ways to make things work now with the digital systems we have that
Yeah.
weren't available previously. And if they work well, they can be very effective.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I work a lot with people who are planning for long distance co-parenting. And actually, the beauty of technology and how it can really help bridge those, the physical gap between a parent and a child. There's really a lot more opportunities there than people realize. So it's definitely something to explore when you're looking at child arrangements.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Claire. It was a really interesting conversation. I'm going to put your email in the notes for the podcast. So if anyone wants to reach out to you for advice, they will be in touch. And thanks for your time.
Great. Thanks, Chloe. It's been really good chat.